It seems to me that I've made several of these videos where I have advocated for something called a central description, a piece of your program, a piece of an application, a piece of a large engineering project. This piece sits in the middle of that thing, especially if it's something mutable like software or easily changeable like software. And that central description is the thing that drives the operation of creation of the features, the experiences, etc., that make up the project or the application. And it's quite reasonable for people to say, well, okay, could you give an example of what you might mean by putting a central description in the middle of a program? If I'm frank, I often take a piece of paper and I'll sketch something out and I'll, erase it or throw it out or whatever, and I'll sketch out an application when I'm sort of having an idea that way. But I don't need to. And I don't also jump into code. I also try not to think about the actual technology that will be employed in making this thing work. I was thinking, all right, let's think about simulating something that is, or presenting something. So say we're going to present some aspects of a simulation of climate change. So I'd like to actually have at the center of this visualization a kind of description of what it is I'm trying to do with the entire application. All right, so so let's start. So it's a visualization of a model, and it's a visualization of a simulation of a model. Okay, something like that. I'm not purposely trying to make this visualization of a simulation of a model. I didn't plan to have this sort of clause within a clause thing going on here, but that's sort of how I describe what it is I'm trying to do. So that means that I'm going to need to explain that further. So, where a model is a theory, where a simulation is a running application that demonstrates the effect, the consequences of the model, where the visualization includes a animated presentation of the simulation. Something like that. Okay. So I'm going to now say, all right, so that's that primary kind of definition of what it is I think this application does. It's primarily it's a presentation. Is it interactive? It could be. It's a parameterized presentation, meaning animation plus configuration page, user, let's see, user supplied configuration choices. So the idea is that, say that someone will be able to pull a slider over and saying, okay, this is the speed at which we are reducing our production of carbon emissions, say carbon dioxide emissions or something like that, and give people some sort of feel for these things to help them interact with simulation, and then they see the actual effects, and then they understand them. So it's a parameterized presentation. I've made this text very big because I'm actually going to make some of it smaller. So if you have a central description like this, kind of in natural language, in the middle of your program, and you're trying to make it operational, that is, you're going to run your program on this, you're going to need to do a few things with this. And one of the things is you want to do is edit it down and make it clearer as well. But one of the things that you could do is you could make something smaller. So in this case, I'm making that size, and I'm going to define this thing this way, and so I think you can kind of see that what I'm thinking of here is something along the lines of a set of definitions that are quickly viewable. So the sort of psychological thing about a central description that you have to do is you have to make it navigatable. That is, you have to be able to look at it and sort of grasp it pretty quickly. So visualization of a simulation of a model. Okay, it's a parameterized presentation. Okay, what do you mean by that? And this is where you might want to put this plus maybe some other comment like that it i.e. Something the user can interact with, which then is well presented as an animated simulation of their choices. I'm a little tired, I guess I could be saying that better. So in any case, that's two of the things that these things are. Now, think about this from a programming standpoint. The visualization of a simulation of a model is something that can make use of a whole bunch of packages that you could have sitting around that when it sees this in the central description, it can say, oh, let's pull in these things because you're probably going to want to make use of those things. And I might further down in the definition. Parameterized presentation means that I'm going to want some sort of a configuration page for the user. These things could be together, but I'm just separating them so it's pretty clear what's going on. All right, so now what I want to make clear sort of the geometry of this. Two places. This first one is the visualization presentation, and the second one is the user configuration page. So I'm going to call these 2 pages. Doesn't matter. It's a 2-page application. Why not? Visual presentation page. User configuration page. All right, so I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So there are lots of ways to go about that. I can say this. So the visual presentation page can be a label. So visual presentation page. And everybody can sort of see, right, that this is sort of similar to some sort of a grammar, if you will, of the thing. And I call these operational grammars. That is, you're defining the thing. I mean, that's what I call them. I mean, you could call it a configuration, because a configuration will always involve things that you then define further. Or maybe they cross-reference, or maybe they collapse into a single thing, and then you can unfold it and expand it and look into it. I mean, there are lots of ways of doing this, but I think of them as operational grammars. That is, if it's driving your program and it has a structure like a little bit like a grammar. And when I say grammar, I'm not thinking about human languages. I'm thinking about pretty much like context-free grammars that we use in computing. Something that has productions. You define x as y, and then the y is made up of a number of things that then get further defined further down, which is classically called a deductive tree, and that's what I mean. So the visual presentation page then would get defined as in this particular case as I'd have to start defining the actual thing that I'm simulating, right? So what I picture is something like just, it will change, right? But this is something like a graph with, oops, too big, graph with nodes and edges, representing variables in the model, and then representation of changes through size of nodes and width and color of edges, something like that. Let me make this a little smaller. Anyway, I think you can start to see that what I've tried to do is make a increasingly detailed description of the application from the largest, most important aspects, and I'm now working my way down to the smaller aspects, and I'll be able to change it. And if I have an environment which facilitates me doing this and facilitates my eventually reducing this to something that is comprehensible by a computer, and at some point, for example, say this, I could put something around it, right? And it's like user configuration page, and this is like, so this could be something that you can then say, I have this whole module that I built that, does user configuration page, and the following will be, this following this in this description will be the user configuration page JSON structure that actually configures all the various things that you might want from the user configuration page based on the presentation, which is something you'll pass it, right? And so you'll start to describe these things that will become more and more like your program, but you're not starting in any way with an environment. You're not starting, except an environment that supports you making these kinds of descriptions, these kinds of central descriptions. Instead, you're making a human description that is gradually becoming the description of the operation of the system that you've defined, and you're doing it in a human manner, and it's the center. It's not just a project description, it's the center of your program, it's the center of your application, it's the center of your system. This could be a very complicated system across many machines and networks and all kinds of things, right? This could be a massive collaboration effort of some sort, in a sea of other collaborative efforts, whatever. This is a human description that is psychologically important to us so that we continue to understand what it is we're trying to do and what it is what are the words that we're using in order, and so in that way maintain a conceptual model as a primary part of the application, as opposed to something that we are projecting onto discrete symbolic elements in the program itself. In other words, if I create a class or an object and I say, oh, one of these things is a this and one of these things is a that, what I've done is I've immediately sort of created a whole range of assumptions about what it is that's in a person's mind when they're looking at those variable names, those class names, those properties, those methods, etc. I don't want to do that. I'd like that stuff to actually be out of the way. I want to actually stay in the human territory and not jump to the notion that somehow in code I'm going to be able to think like this freely while I'm concentrating on the dozens and dozens of aspects and restrictions that are necessary to actually make working code. This has got to be not a separate process, but the driving process. It actually is the thing that you use to then create what you need, aiming towards a definition that then can be, read by supportive software that does all those other things that you'd like to do. Creates classes if you like, creates various kinds of things from the functional programming world, creates something that hasn't been done yet, something from one framework or another development environment. Doesn't matter. This is a human description. In other words, I'm not doing this from the point of view of a Ruby on Rails programmer, or a functional programming person, or an object-oriented programming person, or the notion is that I'm just making a human description, and I'm making it from the largest issues to the smallest issues, and it has to ultimately map to whatever supporting environment it's in, whatever that is. It's a kind of portability argument, but it's also an argument about what essence is in an application. The essence of an application, you could trivially say, oh, it's whatever the application is, but that doesn't tell you very much. In other words, the whole point of it is actually our own cognition and our own psychology. What are those things in it that make it this and not something else? That the differences are things that we do or don't care about. Those are differences that the differences that we do care about are the ones that we see here in this kind of a description, and so that's the essence of the thing. That is, it's not like somehow in the physical world you're defining the essence of an application. You're actually defining it in terms of yourself, what you think is the most important thing. And as you learn things about the application, you'll change this description as you actually are experimenting with it to make it have the effect, psychological effect, for example, in partnership with the user that you want to have with this application. You'll make changes to this description, and of course, not just operational operational changes, but also explanatory changes. That is, and comprehensibility changes, and maybe the way you express things will be different as well over time. But you'll understand this. Whereas if all that stuff was tacit and hidden and in your mind, and you've got some symbolic representation in classes or objects or functions or something, in the world of your programming paradigm du jour, then you've got to somehow extract the thing that I'm showing you here. You've got to somehow extract that from all that code. Which, let's be frank, it's code. It may have all kinds of ambitions as code, but it is still an attempt to create symbols that represent things in our heads, and that stuff that's actually in our heads is much more complex, and we haven't had a chance to actually stay with the stuff in our heads, and then work later at making that turn into some sort of a code, some sort of code. So again, this is sort of the kind of thing I mean by an operational, central description that describes the essence of something, and that is basically the core of the application. And we have so little in the way of infrastructure for getting this sort of basic human, psychological comfort and maintainability kind of feature in place in programs today, which is just very difficult to do this. And so this is anyway the kind of thing that I mean.